Get your things and get out now!" Tiana's breath caught in her throat. She clutched her 4-year-old son's hand as the landlord, Gerald Langley, towered over her. "You people always think you can stay rent-free," he spat. Tiana's hands trembled. "I paid you," Gerald smirked. "Not my problem. You're out." Her son whimpered, hiding behind her leg. Tiana's chest tightened. Where would they go? Then a black car pulled up. The driver stepped out, and the moment Gerald saw who it was, his face drained of color, because this wasn't just anyone. This was the last person he wanted to see. What happens next? Let's see it together. The neighborhood of Willowbrook Heights had always been a place of stark contrasts. On one side, sprawling mansions lined the streets, their iron gates and manicured lawns a symbol of old money and power. On the other side, a cluster of aging apartment complexes where families struggled to make ends meet, where single mothers like Tiana Lawson fought every day just to survive. Tonight, under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, her entire world was about to collapse. Tiana had never been the type to ask for handouts. She had grown up in a small town, raised by a single mother who had taught her the value of hard work, pride, and perseverance. At 28 years old, she had built a life she could be proud of. She had a job at a local law firm as an administrative assistant, not glamorous, but steady. She had a son, Elijah, who had just turned 4. And she had a small 1-bedroom apartment, old and worn but filled with love. She had worked too hard to let it all slip away. But tonight, her world was hanging by a thread. For months, Tiana had struggled to keep up with her rent. Not because she didn't work hard enough, not because she was irresponsible, but because life wasn't fair. Rent had skyrocketed in her area. Daycare prices were outrageous. And after an unexpected medical bill from Elijah's asthma attack, she had fallen 2 weeks behind on rent. She had done everything right. She had paid what she could. She had explained her situation. She had begged for an extension. But her landlord, Gerald Langley, had made it clear, "I don't care about your excuses. I want my money, or you and that kid can sleep on the streets." And now, it was time to make good on that threat. The night was cold. Tiana stood in the hallway of her apartment building, her hands shaking as she held onto her son's tiny fingers. She had hoped, prayed, that maybe Gerald wouldn't show up tonight. Maybe he'd give her just a little more time. But as the sound of heavy boots echoed through the corridor, she knew her prayers had gone unanswered. Bang, bang, bang! The door shook under the force of his pounding. "Open up, Tiana!" She flinched. Elijah gripped her leg. "Mommy, I'm scared." Tiana swallowed the lump in her throat. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "I won't let anything happen to you." But her voice betrayed her, because the truth was, she didn't know what to do. The lock clicked and the door swung open. Gerald Langley towered over her, mid-50s, balding, a permanent sneer etched onto his face. He smelled of cheap whiskey and arrogance, and behind him, 2 security goons, hired muscle, eager to throw out a single mother and her child. Tiana stood her ground. "Please, Gerald," she said, keeping her voice calm. "I just need a little more time." Gerald chuckled. "Time? Lady, I gave you time. You think I run a charity?" Tiana clenched her jaw. "I paid you half," she said, her voice breaking. "I told you I just needed another week." Gerald stepped forward, his smirk twisting. "And I told you I don't care. You people always think you can get a free ride." Tiana felt her blood boil. "What do you mean, you people?" Gerald smirked. "You know exactly what I mean." Tiana's fists tightened. She'd spent her whole life dealing with men like him, men who thought power made them untouchable, men who thought they could kick people down just because they had more money. She wasn't going to beg, not to him. But then she felt Elijah clutch her leg tighter. His little face was buried against her coat, trembling. And just like that, her fight turned into something else. It wasn't about pride anymore, it was about her son. She looked into Gerald's cold eyes. "Just let my son stay inside," she said quietly. "I'll figure something out. Just don't do this in front of him." Gerald grinned. "Lady, you're both getting out. Right now." Tiana's stomach sank. She felt Elijah's little fingers tighten in hers, and for the first time in a long time, Tiana Lawson felt helpless. But then, power walked in. The hallway was dead silent. Gerald had already turned toward the security goons. Get them out! But before they could take a step, a deep voice rang out. "Not another move!" Everyone froze. Tiana's breath hitched. The air shifted, because standing at the entrance of the building was a man in an expensive black suit, sharp jawline, cold, calculating eyes, and a presence that made even Gerald take a step back. The man's voice was calm, but deadly. "You're making a big mistake, Langley." Gerald narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek business card, and handed it to Gerald. As Gerald's eyes scanned the name, his face drained of color. His hands started to tremble. Because now, he realized who he was messing with. Tiana frowned. She looked up at the stranger, confused. "Who are you?" she whispered. The man turned to her, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority. "My name is Julius Cole." Tiana blinked. That name sounded familiar. But before she could ask, Julius turned back to Gerald, and his next words changed everything. "You don't own this building anymore." Gerald's eyes bulged. "What?" Julius smiled. "Pack your things, Langley. You're evicted." Gerald Langley's face drained of color. His hands trembled as he stared at the sleek business card in his palm. Julius Cole. The name alone sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just some rich man stepping in where he didn't belong. This was a man with real power, a man who could destroy him. But Gerald wasn't about to back down so easily. He forced himself to straighten, trying to regain his composure. "So what?" he sneered. "You think you can just walk in here and make demands?" Julius's expression didn't change. "That's exactly what I'm doing." His voice was calm, controlled, dangerous. Tiana, still holding Elijah's tiny hand, could barely breathe. She'd spent the past 4 years struggling, scraping by, being told by people like Gerald that she was nothing. And now? Now someone was standing up for her. It felt unreal. Gerald laughed bitterly. "You don't scare me, Cole. I own this building. I have contracts. I have rights." Julius took a step forward. The sheer force of his presence made Gerald take a step back. "Not anymore," Julius said smoothly. "As of this morning, I bought out your stake." Gerald stopped breathing. His eyes darted around wildly. You're bluffing." Julius reached into his pocket and pulled out a folder. He tossed it onto the ground. Gerald's security goons stiffened. Tiana's heartbeat pounded. Gerald hesitated, then bent down and snatched up the folder. His hands shook as he flipped through the legal documents. His own signature was stamped at the bottom of one of the pages, and right next to it, Julius Cole's signature. A finalized sale, his worst nightmare. Gerald's mouth went dry. This is impossible." Julius adjusted his cufflinks. "You made a deal with the wrong people, Langley. You thought no one would check the fine print." He tilted his head slightly. "And now? You don't own a damn thing." The weight of the truth crashed over Gerald like a tsunami. His apartment empire, gone. His security, useless. His power shattered. No, this can't be happening," Gerald shouted. He turned to his guards. "Get him out of here." The security men hesitated. They glanced at each other. Then one of them took a slow step away. The other followed. Julius smiled. "They work for the building now," he said, "and the building works for me." Gerald's face twisted in rage. "You can't do this!" Julius raised a brow. "Oh, I can." He gestured toward the front door. "Pack your things. You have 30 minutes to vacate. After that, security will escort you out like the disrespectful, arrogant fraud you are." Gerald lunged forward, but one of the security guards grabbed him by the arm and yanked him back. "You don't want to do that, sir," the guard muttered. Gerald was shaking. This wasn't just losing money. This was losing everything. His pride, his empire, his reputation. For the first time, Tiana took a slow step forward. She looked Gerald directly in the eye. "You called me worthless," she said quietly. Gerald's breath hitched. "You called me you people, like I wasn't even human." She tilted her head slightly. "How does it feel?" Gerald's jaw clenched. "You think you're better than me now?" Tiana exhaled. "Number." "But I was never beneath you either." She bent down and lifted Elijah into her arms, her son, who had been watching everything. She looked at Gerald one last time. Then she turned away, because for the first time in years, she wasn't the one struggling to breathe. Gerald stumbled back. He looked around the room, at the security team, at Tiana, at Julius, all of them waiting for him to leave. He opened his mouth to argue, to demand, to plead, but no words came out, because there was nothing left to say. He had built his empire on fear, control, and power, and now he had none. With one last defeated glare, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the exit. As the door slammed shut behind him, Tiana felt something she hadn't felt in years: relief. Julius turned to her. "Ms. Lawson, I apologize for what you've been through. That ends today." Tiana hesitated. She had spent so long fighting, struggling, barely making it. She didn't know what to say. Julius pulled out another document. "This is a new lease agreement," he said. "Your rent is covered for the next 6 months. No strings attached." Tiana froze. "What?" "You deserve stability," Julius said simply, "and I believe in investing in people who deserve better." Tiana's eyes burned. For the first time in years, she let the tears fall. "Thank you," she whispered. Julius nodded. Then, with a final glance at the doors where Gerald had vanished, he smirked. "Justice feels good, doesn't it?" Tiana smiled. "For once?" She nodded. "Yeah, it really does." The night air was cool and crisp. Tiana stood on the sidewalk, still gripping the lease agreement in her hands, her mind struggling to process everything. For years she had fought against an unforgiving world. For years she had been told she was not enough, that she would never win, that no matter how hard she worked, someone like her would always struggle. But tonight was different, because for the first time, she had won. And the man who had tried to destroy her, he was gone. A few blocks away, Gerald Langley sat in the front seat of his old, rusted Ford sedan. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The empire he had built, the power he had wielded over people like Tiana, the security he had taken for granted, all of it was gone. And the worst part? He had no one to blame but himself. For the first time, he felt the weight of what it was like to be powerless, to have nowhere to go, to feel like the world had turned its back on him. And the bitter truth? It had, because he had turned his back on so many before. Now, he was just another name on a long list of forgotten men, a man who had it all and threw it away. Tiana took a deep breath, looking over at Julius. "You didn't have to do this for me," she said, her voice still shaking. Julius gave a small smile. "You're right. I didn't." Tiana frowned. "Then, why did you—" Julius slipped his hands into his pockets, his eyes calm but intense. "Because someone did it for me once." Tiana's breath hitched. Julius looked down at Elijah, who was gripping his mother's hand tightly. "You remind me of my own mother," he admitted. Tiana's eyes widened slightly. Julius exhaled. She worked herself to the bone to give me a future. People like Gerald, they tried to keep us down. He shrugged. But we fought back. His gaze sharpened. And now? It's your turn. Tiana's fingers tightened around the lease agreement. For the first time in years, she felt hope. Real hope. Not the kind that comes from wishing things would get better. The kind that comes from knowing they finally are. As Julius turned to leave, Tiana called out, "Wait!" He stopped, glancing over his shoulder. Tiana swallowed hard. "How do I thank you?" Julius studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled. Simple. He nodded toward Elijah. Make sure he never grows up thinking he's less than anyone else. Tiana's throat tightened. She looked down at her son, his big, curious eyes staring up at her, and she knew that was exactly what she would do. As Julius walked away, disappearing into the city, Tiana took a deep breath. She knelt down beside Elijah, brushing his hair back gently. "You hear that, baby?" she whispered. Elijah nodded slowly. "You're gonna be someone," she told him. "You already are." The little boy smiled, and for the first time in a long, long time, Tiana smiled too, because the fight wasn't over. But for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. What do you think about Gerald's downfall? Did he deserve it? What would you do if you were in Tiana's position? Have you ever seen karma work this fast? Watch until the end to see how one moment can change everything. Like if you believe in second chances. Subscribe for more powerful stories that expose injustice and inspire change. Because sometimes life doesn't just turn the tables, it flips them completely.